We continue with more of the Open Forum, a program of discussion regarding biblical issues. This broadcast has been pre-recorded. We will not be taking live calls over the air. However, we encourage you to stay tuned, hoping you will gain much insight into the Bible from the inquiries that others have made. Again, this Open Forum has been pre-recorded. Here now is our host and Bible teacher, Harold Camping.
We're going on with the Open Forum program, and shall we take our next call, please? Good evening. Welcome to Open Forum.
Yes, good evening. I want to, I guess I should say, third birthday greetings.
Thank you.
Many, many more. I want to ask what the significance of Numbers 3 is when Moses was told to number the Levites, the sons of the Levites, to get the firstborn so that he could redeem the rest of Israel. And when you look in verses like 22, 28, and 34, he numbers them to 22,300 because he gives us the different numbers. And yet God drops the 300 in verse 39 and says all the males from a month old were 20 and 2,000. I just wondered why God, when he gave us all the numbers, drops the 300, and then he has to redeem them later on. He needed that 300 to redeem them. He needed 22,273, and I cannot figure it out.
Well, you know, in Numbers, God, in the Bible, God frequently uses numbers very, very carefully to illustrate some kind of spiritual truth. I admit that I have looked at this a number of times and have puzzled over it, and frankly, it's been a long time since I've looked at it, and I'm not sure that I even resolved it when I did look at it. When we get down to verse 43, for example, it says, all the firstborn males by the number of names from a month old and upward of those that were numbered of them were 22,273. In other words, 273 over the 22,000. And then notice that, and for those that are to be redeemed of the 213 of the firstborn of the children of Israel, I'm reading verse 46, which are more than the Levites, thou shalt even take 5 shekels apiece by the poll. After the shekel of the sanctuary shalt they take them. The shekel is 20 gerahs. Now, and so then when we take 273 and multiply that by 5, we get down to verse 50. Of the firstborn of the children of Israel took he the money 1,365 shekels after the shekel of the sanctuary. It is, let's see, it's 5 times 273.
It was 1365.
1365. Yes, that's what we have in verse 50. And so it's all done very precisely, in other words. And there is and the 22,000 is in order to end up with that 273, so that in turn that would end up with the 1365. But to tell you what the spiritual meaning of all this is, I am unable to do that. It certainly does have spiritual meaning. Because
it is interesting that he gave us the numbers to add up to 22,300 of the sons of the Levites, the three sons of Levi.
Well, you see, and so God really is indicating that the 22,000 is a contrived number. And because he wants to focus on that 22,000.
Okay.
And it just didn't happen to be coincidental that it was 22,000, but God actually contrived it. We have the same thing in Matthew chapter 1, where God uses a contrived number, and that is, he uses a number to first of all, when I say contrived, it doesn't mean that it is not a true number.
Right.
To speak of 22,300 people, or to round it off at 22,000, there were 22,000 people there. They're both correct statements, depending on the accuracy that we're giving to that. We would never dare. In other words, when we use the round number 22,000, we normally, if for example there were a crowd of people, and someone asked you how many were there, well, we counted and there were 22,000 people there. We're not saying there were 22,000 exactly.
Right.
There could have been 22,103 or 21,982, but in round numbers there were 22,000 people there. And so God picks up on that methodology in order to get on with the principle that he wants to talk about the 273 who were redeemed, and that is who had to have 5 gerars paid apiece, or no, 5 shekels apiece. But how it all ties together, I'm not qualified to talk about. What I started to say is, if you read Matthew chapter 1, it's very interesting that that God goes through the generations from Abraham to Joseph, and he says from Abraham to David were 14 generations, and from David to the Babylonian captivity were 14 generations. I'm quoting from memory now. And then from the Babylonian captivity to Christ there were 14 generations. And yet when you analyze it very carefully, in at least one instance, the same individual is used twice in order to get the 3 times 14. See, again, it's a contrived number. And while it is true what is being stated, nevertheless it is true only to the degree that we understand how God is speaking of it, and it could be untrue if we would look at it from the wrong vantage point. Of course, that's true of any statement of the Bible, but the point being that God wants to focus on those 3 14s, or the total of 42, and that emphasizes very strongly that there is spiritual meaning in these numbers. And we may not always understand or even begin to understand what the spiritual meaning is, but we certainly know that the gospel is hidden there very definitely.
Well, thank you. Could I just ask a real quick question?
Yes.
In 2 Timothy 2:15, where it says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." What does that mean, rightly dividing the word of truth?
1 Timothy.
2 Timothy.
2 Timothy 2:15. Yes, a very, very lovely verse. Let me read it again. "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Now that simply means that we correctly or rightly deal with the scriptures according to biblical principles. Rightly dividing the word means that we don't put our own ideas into the Bible. We let the Bible guide us as to how we're to understand the Bible, how we're to deal with the words in the Bible, but we don't try to be an authority over the Bible. We let the Bible guide us all together.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for calling. And shall we take our next call, please? Welcome to Open Forum.
Brother Camping?
Yes.
How are you tonight?
Very well, thank you.
Okay, I have a question in the book of Leviticus,
Yes.
chapter 11, verse 12, where it says, "Any water creature that has fins or scales are forbidden to eat." Now, I assume that this talks about lobsters, crabs, any kind of shellfish. And what I need to know is, does that same law apply for today? And I'll hang up and I'll take my call over the air.
All right. The question is, in the Old Testament, God had various laws concerning what kind of meat could be eaten. There were certain animals that were called clean animals, and God defined what they were by the way whether they chewed the cud or not, or whether their hoof was divided or not. And there were certain birds that were clean and unclean. there were certain fish that were clean or unclean. For example, a shark could not be eaten. Any of the smooth-skinned fish that had no scales, like catfish, could not be eaten. They were unclean. Now, were these simply dietary laws so that Israel might remain more healthy? The answer is no, not at all. They had nothing to do with trying to stay healthy. They were simply laws that God had established to focus on a principle, that there are two kinds of people in the world, clean and unclean. Those who are saved or coming into salvation are typified as the clean. Those who are unsaved and outside of the possibility of salvation are unclean, typified by the unclean animals. When Christ went to the cross, however, God removed that distinction because it was his intention that the gospel would go into all the world and that whoever called upon the name of the Lord could be saved. The promise is to you and your children and all that are afar off. And we're not to look at the heathen out there anymore as being beyond the possibility of salvation, as was the case before Christ went to the cross. And so God removed also that particular law. It no longer had any substance. And if you read Acts chapter 8 and Acts chapter 9, you see the experiences of Peter as God is preparing him. And Peter was a very devout Jew who rigorously and religiously kept those dietary laws. He would never have touched catfish. Never would he have eaten a horse meat or pig. No possibility. He would have been abhorred by it. And yet God gave him a vision. He let down a sheet from heaven, and on it were all kinds of unclean animals. And God says, "Rise, Peter, kill and eat." And Peter was abhorred by it. Not so, not so. And God said, what God has called clean, call not common any longer. And this was preparation, because he was going to begin to minister to a heathen dog, a Roman centurion by the name of Cornelius. Later on in 1 Timothy chapter 4, God further gives us information by saying all things can be eaten if they are received with thanksgiving. So, insofar as the Bible is concerned, we can eat pork, or we can eat rattlesnake, or we can eat catfish, or we can eat crab, or we can eat any foods at all if it is received with thanksgiving. And thank you for calling and sharing. And shall we take our next call, please? Welcome to Open Forum.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, Mr. Campy. Happy birthday to you.
My, that was quite a chorus. Thank you very, very much.
Okay, sir, I have a question.
Yes.
Okay, it's time to get serious now.
Now you're all discombobulated because you just went through that action.
Okay, so the question on Revelation 21, chapter 13 through 14.
Revelation 21.
Yes, 13 through 14.
13 and 14. Let's look at that.
Okay, now a lot of people preached about damnation, that there's a place of torment and then a lake of fire. Now, a lot of argue about these verses